Okay, this is a lecture about the angiosperm plant body. So we're looking at flowering plants and specifically structure function. I think I'm going to have a lecture for each of the organs, and so let's look at that overall. So we know there's an organism, and then the grouping or the the next level of organization under an organism is the organ systems. So plants have two organ systems, the shoot organ system and the root organ system. Typically, the shoot organ system is above ground and the root is below ground, but that's not always true. They're interdependent, meaning that the root takes in products and or makes products that are important for the shoot system, and the shoot system makes products, takes in products, and transports products that are important for the root organ system. So there's all kinds of labels on here. You just want to know this. It's pretty straightforward, and we'll look at them as we go through each of the organs. But here are the three main organs: the leaf organ, the stem organ, and then the root organ here. Roots have, I'm classifying it into three major functions. And we'll see how the structure of roots facilitate the function. So the first function is to anchor vascular plants, and they absorb water and nutrients, large part minerals, which are metal ions from the soil. You also see in a minute that roots are going to actually take up oxygen from the soil because they need that for for cellular respiration in their cells. So yes, roots quote unquote breathe. I wouldn't call it that because breathing is an active process, but they do gas exchange. And then also food storage, some roots are modified for that. So let's look at anchoring. Let's just look at two main types of roots. In general, the eudicots, or you can call them eudicots, that's one group of flowering plants. It is the most widespread and diverse of the angiosperms today. They have what's called a taproot. So we have a main root here, and then we have lateral roots coming off of it, and then you have sublateral roots coming off of that. And a monocot, which is another type or another group of angiosperms, have what we call fibrous roots. So you can see at the end of the stem, and this would be the part below ground, the roots just come off that stem and then they branch out right away. They don't have this main root. And you can see here the fibrous part. I do have to say that I have dug up plants in the yard before, and I know they're eudicots because of their leaves and their flowers and all that, but they have fibrous roots. Sometimes woody fibrous roots, which is, you'd expect woody to go with eudicots. And so what I discovered is that if you grow a eudicot plant from a cutting, so sometimes with plants you can cut part of a parent plant and then grow it into a new plant. If you do that, most of the time or often it will form fibrous roots, the new plant. So this going for the seed is when you get the taproot. So anyway, if you ever pull up plants, like I did this with a hibiscus once, and I was like, I know a hibiscus is a eudicot, why does it have fibrous roots? Or at least structure of fibrous roots, not a taproot, and that turned out to be why. Second function, roots absorbing water and minerals from the soil. So the minerals themselves are things like ammonium ions and phosphate ions. So we're looking at ions here. And part of what is the cycling in the environment that plants are really important for here is nitrogen. So in order for animals to get nitrogen, they can't take it up directly. They have to eat a plant or eat something that ate a plant. And where do the plants get their nitrogen? They get it from absorbing it from the soil, or they can get it from these bacteria in the nodules. So the soil is going to have nitrogen being formed into products that the plant can absorb by bacteria, the nitrogen fixation bacteria, and then the ammonification, nitrification, so all those bacteria that live in the soil. And there's other groups, types of bacteria like rhizobium, we talked about that in the bacteria section, that live in these little nodules on certain types of plants, and those bacteria fix nitrogen in there. Why would they need nitrogen? They need it for nucleic acids, and this is true of all organisms. All organisms have to build RNA and DNA, which have the nitrogenous bases. And they have to build proteins, which are made of amino acid subunits, which have amino groups, which have nitrogen in them. Then you need phosphate atoms for ATP, triphosphate, and nucleic acids. Again, your DNA and RNA have phosphate groups. And then the absorption of those is aided by mycorrhizae. So the mycorrhiza, or remember, is this mutualistic relationship between the fungus, you can see that here, and the root cells. And you can see the fungus branches into the root. The fungus helps the plant absorb phosphate ions better. So that's a mutualistic relationship, so we have both of those. Water is also brought in through the roots for the plant. So when you water a plant, watering the leaves is not going to do anything. If it's really hot out, it might cool the leaves down, which could be helpful. Just the water evaporation taking away the heat. But it's not going to be able to get water in through its leaves. It has to get water in through the roots. And so that's why you water the soil instead of the leaves of a plant. And then you can see also, like I mentioned, oxygen is coming into those roots for cellular respiration in the mitochondria, because every cell in the plant that's living does cellular respiration to make ATP. And then CO2 is a byproduct of cellular respiration. And in the roots, because there's no photosynthesis, it's not used up there, it's just released into the environment. We also have a physical structure called root hairs. And so root hairs are these cells that have an extension of the plasma membrane. So you can see all these circles are individual cells, and these ones just have a long extension. And what that does is it increases surface area for absorption of water and minerals, and that would be across the membrane through channels and transporters. But the root hairs, they're so little, it doesn't have very much volume, so it doesn't actually require much more energy and resources to maintain, but it gets you a lot more absorption. But the thing to note about the roots is that, first of all, they have what we call a vascular cylinder. So the vascular cylinder, in both of them you can see, is in the middle. Vasculature refers to the types of tissue that move things around the plant. Just like our cardiovascular system is, which you're looking at the heart and then all the blood vessels. In this case, their version of vessels are the xylem, carrying water and minerals from the root, and the phloem, which is carrying sugars primarily, and that's going to the root. We'll see where that's made later. This is basically taking a root and you've cut it, and now you're looking down on it. So the vasculature is in the middle in a root. Eudicot has its xylem in the X shape, which is convenient, so it has these, and then the phloem is around the arms of the xylem. Whereas the monocot root has a ring of xylem and phloem. Okay, so you just want to be able to identify that if I gave you a picture of a cross-section, which is a monocot, which is a eudicot. Is it a root? Is it a stem? The point of this, I'm not going to be too detailed about it, at least unless I let you know differently, is that there's regulation of what goes into a plant. Water and minerals can move two different ways. One is actually going into the root hair, into the cytosol, and being transported through the plasmodesmata between cells until it gets to the xylem. And so this going across the plasma membrane means it has to go across in a regulated way, because the only way to get in is by going, I mentioned, through channels and transport proteins, and they're selective, right? So that's the regulation. However, there's another way that water and minerals can get into a plant root. So it's called apoplastic, and what it is that it kind of travels along the cell walls, and the hydrophilic characteristic of the cellulose and the water can hydrogen bond together, and so it can travel between the cells, really. And so that's not selective. So in the end, though, in order to have selectivity, there's this strip of waxy material, and it's in between all the cells. So this actually wraps around the whole cell. And waxes are lipids, and lipids, as we know, are hydrophobic. So that means when the water and minerals get to this Casparian strip, the waxy layer, they can't get through, hydrophobic, hydrophilic. And so then they are transported or shunted into the cell, and then have to go, if they get in, across the membrane, and then there's more regulation. And so it's actually, in the end, it never just gets to go into the vasculature unless it goes through some transport proteins. The third function I mentioned was that some roots are modified to store organic nutrients. And by organic molecules, I pretty much mean starch, which is a polysaccharide type carbohydrate. And then the plant can access that starch and break it back down into glucose monomers in order to use it later when maybe it's not doing photosynthesis and making those carbohydrates all the time. There's also some storage of the sucrose itself. That's why you can get, sugar beets. Sugar is the sucrose, and carrots are a little bit sweet. It's also, like when you cook beets, if you cook them like by cutting them up real small, they get caramelized. And it's very sweet, and that's because there are those sugar storage in there. It's also why nutritionally you have to consider root vegetables pretty much a carbohydrate, and a carbohydrate that can be used in humans for energy. Also why, if you're somebody who's diabetic, you have to take into account, like, a carrot is not like eating a lettuce leaf. Lettuce leaf is mostly cellulose carbs. We can't break those down. But a carrot has the carbohydrates we can break down into glucose in the form of starch. If you're trying to make sure your glucose stays at a certain level, you do have to consider the glucose that will come from eating a root vegetable like a carrot. So plants only grow from their tips. The tips of the shoots, which are the branches and the main stem, and the tips of the roots. And that's how they get longer. So primary growth is growing longer. Just some terms and some interesting things. So determinate growth, which is what we think of usually, animals, because we are one, that basically means the organism grows to a certain size, and then that is the life, that's the adult version of the organism, and then it just stops. So that's determinate. Plants exhibit indeterminate growth. It's dependent upon resources and structure of the plant, but they can just keep growing as long as they have those resources and space and the structure to keep it oriented correctly. So they would just keep growing from the tips. You might hear these terms when you do gardening. So annual plants mean that they go from, we could say, seed to seed. So they grow from the seed and produce seeds themselves in 1 year. Biennials would be completing life cycle in 2 years. And then perennials would live for many years. So perennials are the ones you plant in your garden, and then they look like they die or they go away, but then they'll come back the next year. Herbaceous plants, all monocots, some eudicots. What that means is that they are not woody. So they're real, bendy type stems. They'll look green versus woody stems, some eudicots. And this is also for roots too. Okay, so primary growth, I mentioned it's just at the tips. All growth in plants happens at regions of stem cells. So these meristems, so the name meristem, the word there, so stem cells. So the meristem is where the stem cells are located. Apical, so you can think of, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but you might know the word apex, A-P-E-X, apex, which is like the apex of a mountain is the top of it. So apical meristems are the meristems at the tips. These are ones on the roots where the purple is showing. And so the roots only grow from the tips. You probably, in Bio 1, looked at onion root tips because there was mitosis to see cell division. So why is there cell division? That's where the stem cells are. So you've got a root cap on the end that helps protect the root as it's pushing through soil. Then you have the region of division, which makes sense because as it divides, it's just going to grow from the tips. So it has the dividing cells, and then it elongates, then they differentiate. And you can see, like, for example, become a root hair cell. Lateral roots, actually, they're going to have to connect to the vascular cylinder, right? Because that's where all the water, minerals go into the rest of the plant, and also where the food comes down into the root. And so what it actually does is it grows out of the vascular cylinder, pushes through And then you have the lateral root, and it's connected with xylem and phloem there. And this is a cool picture here. You can see the vascular cylinder here. It's a root. And you can see the attachment of this lateral root to that vascular cylinder. So the plants grow down through the tips. They can also grow laterally, but it's still through tips. How do roots know where to grow? They respond to gravity. So positive gravitropism means it grows towards the direction of gravity. And so you can see here, here's a root growing sideways, and if you left it, that root would curve down to grow towards gravity. And why does that happen? That happens because of hormones. So if you recall, hormones are ligands or ligands that are produced in one part of an organism and then travel to another part of an organism or even outside of the organism and work there. Remember, the ligand or ligand is the signaling molecule, and then just recall with signaling, the ligand binds the receptor, and that's reception. Then there's a bunch of molecular steps that happen in between called transduction, and then something in the end happens, we call it a cellular response. How do the roots detect gravity? There's certain types of cells with the statoliths in them, which are like sacs of membrane, and I believe they're usually filled with starch. But we got these sacs here. And so this root has been turned on its side. Okay, so this root has been turned like this on its side. And so what happens, statoliths fall in the cell, in the cytoplasm, and they end up on the side of the cell where gravity is. And in a root, there's a hormone, and it's in other parts of the plant, but the hormone that I'm going to concentrate on here are the auxins. So auxin's job, when it's in relatively low concentrations, it stimulates cells to elongate. And if you have it in high concentrations, it inhibits the cells from elongating. And if you have no auxin, it's not going to elongate either. So what happens is that the falling of the statoliths induces a difference of auxin production. So the side that's away from the statoliths, basically this side of the root, is going to end up with lower auxin. So auxin will turn on, but not too much. So that makes the cells on that side get longer. The concentration on this bottom side here towards gravity has a lot of auxin, so it's a high concentration, which means the cells actually don't elongate. So if you have cells elongating on the top but not the bottom, and so that bends the root towards gravity, and that's why even if you turn a plant upside down, the roots will turn around, if you will, and grow towards gravity. So here's some modifications of roots. So there's some roots that are outside of soil. So we call these epiphytes. Epi means on top of. Phyte is going to be plants. Phyto, plant, or plant-like. So epiphytes are plants that live on top of other plants. Or they could live like on a power line or something. And so they have roots called aerial roots. You can see those here in an orchid. That's a classic epiphyte. And here's those aerial roots. And so basically they are going to absorb, they still absorb the water, they just have to do it through water vapor. Epiphytes don't hurt the plants. Then there's also adaptations for nutrition. Parasitic plants will live on other plants or other organisms, and they basically steal their nutrients. So mistletoe, ironically, even though it's a, winter, Christmas, holiday, I love you thing, is actually a parasitic plant that kills the plant it's growing on. And it doesn't look like holly berries either. Look up what mistletoe look like. It's totally different than what you probably think. In any case, it does do photosynthesis, but it's going to steal the nutrients from that plant. Then you have some very unusual plants, though, that don't even do photosynthesis. They get all their carbon from being a parasite on other plants or other organisms. And we talked about storage roots. That's an adaptation to store starches and sugars until later. We have modifications for supporting plants. Some of these are angiosperms and some are gymnosperms. The buttress roots you can see here are a few different types of trees. And in fact, if you look around Houston, we have them all over the place. There's cypress trees. These are very large buttress roots, obviously. That's a person. And they are kind of sheets that come out from up on the trunk. So their roots, part of it's above ground, which is, more unusual. And they are going to help support that tree from falling over. Typically, that's because it's in some sort of boggy soil, like you'd see in either of these. There's also a type of root, similar function, called a prop root. Corn has it. It's a hollow tree in Hawaii. You also have roots that help plants get oxygen, or probably. This is probably their function. So the pneumatophores. Pneumo is always meaning like lung. It's going to be the oxygen gas exchange. Might have also heard them called knees. So mangroves are classic pneumatophore plants. Cypress trees, besides the buttress roots, they also have pneumatophores for probably gas exchange up here. So all of these are just extensions of parts of the roots of all these other trees, of all the trees. There's also roots that can grow around plants. So often you see stems growing around other plants, but roots can do it too. Some of them are strangler roots, which means they kill the host in the end. And often they'll kill the host and then they have the structure now of the host basically, and they'll just exist because they can stand up now. You might also see them growing on buildings. They're quite destructive. And then we're looking at economic roles. That's something important. I will ask you about, tell me some economic roles of each stem or each organ in plants. So food, so you'd want to know food examples of roots, carrots, beets, sugar beets, sweet potato, not yam. Yam and sweet potatoes are different. Sweet potato though, radishes, turnips, parsnips, tapioca, cassava. Okay. We also have drinks. Tisanes or tisanes are, we call them herbal tea, and some of those are made with roots. Like if you look on herbal teas, you'll see often it says this root, mallow root and valerian root and all that kind of stuff. Bitters that you might use in alcoholic beverages are primarily roots. Some types of medicine, sort of alternative medicines or supplementary medicines, some of which have supported function and some of which don't, but they're people buy a lot of these, so it's monetarily important. So health supplements like ginseng is a root. It's supposed to give you energy. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that one. Licorice root though can help with pain. So cough drops to soothe the pain in the throat might have licorice root in it. Toothaches. There are teas with licorice root in it that are supposed to be for sore throats and stuff. And then if you look at essential oils, a lot of those are roots as well. Like valerian is a classic one. And those are used for a variety of purposes, some of which are useful and some of which are perhaps not supported. You just have to be careful with that. Then we also have economically agriculture. You can't just say roots are part of plants. We grow plants because they're crops, and so roots are important. That's no. But you can specifically say roots, the ones from legumes or clovers that have the nodules, can be important in crop rotation. And so that's because it replenishes nitrogen to the soil, which then the next year when you plant different crops, it has nitrogen in the soil, so it's good for that next round of crops. Food for grazing livestock, i.e. like grasses. And then grasses, because of those fibrous roots, also help with erosion prevention. So if you're having problems with parts of your yard or a riverbank eroding, if you plant some grass on there and you can keep that alive, it'll help prevent the erosion, which is important. There are also dyes. If you're going to use dye as an example in on your exam, you need some specific examples of dye because pretty much every plant part can probably be used for dye. You cannot use it for all 5 plant parts. But in this case, we have a red madder root and smooth sumac for black. Those have been used in the past to dye things. You can also make soap ingredients out of roots. So saponins are like surfactants. They're soap type molecules. And so yucca can be used for that. Soapwort, so I have some pictures of that here. So soapweed, yucca, soapwort plants. So now you should have enough information to fill in any packets or notes that I've given you to learn about the plant roots.